This week, we're bringing you part 2 of our listener request from Brad of Kim's Uncle Pizza in Westmont, Illinois.
We also want to shout out our friends at Pizza Michi in Chicago, award-winning pizza at both those spots. And if you're familiar with them, go to those restaurants and you can see paintings hanging on their wall by Muriel Montgomery.
Yes, you can. This story is a Chicago classic, just like pizza. Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb and the perfect murder. If you're familiar with this podcast, sometimes our one-parters turn into 2 parts, and sometimes our 2-parters turn into 3-parters. Mm-hmm. So you're in luck, guys. We're actually going to tell the story in 3 parts. Basically, after I finished this stupid episode, I found another really great book on the case published recently called Nothing But the Night by Greg King and Penny Wilson. And I wanted to rewrite the second half to reflect some of that information. It's a great book, and it kind of debunks some of the commonly held beliefs of the case. So
great.
It flipped the whole thing on its head for me, and I want to flip you on your head too.
Yeah, that's right, baby. You got a trilogy on your hands now.
Anyway, we're playing fast and loose over here.
Uh-huh.
And also, just for the record, part 2 and 3 are fun as hell.
Okay, good.
For this episode, I also used the book Murder Among Friends by Candace Fleming.
Cool. All right. Big love goes out to our Patreon supporters. Got to shout out Bailey H for hitting us up. Hey, if you want immediate access to part 3 of this story, you can do that on Patreon. You can do that on Spotify exclusive. Thank you so much, Bailey, for signing up, throwing us dollars on Muriel's Murders Patreon or through the Spotify Muriel's Murders subscription is the very best way to support what we do. Plus, you get immediate access to part 3 of this series and a whole back catalog of true crime exclusive episodes and non-true crime episodes of the podcast, formerly known as Hella. Muriel'sMurders.com/support has all the information. Our newest 5-star reviews on Apple warmed our hearts. Shout outs and thank yous go to 1948 JJC and Jesus up her ASS ? Thank you to everyone subscribing and liking on YouTube. You guys are nice to us on social media, and you share it with the people in your life, and we love you for that. Thank you very much.
Yes, and for funsies, we're recording this podcast now on video.
Yes.
So that's on YouTube.
Yep.
So for those of us who've been longtime listeners, you might find a few times we're negotiating the camera. We're getting used to it.
Correct. Yes.
If you're listening for the first time, eventually we'll get it together.
Okay, good.
All right. This is a true story involving murder, violence, drugs, adult themes, etc. So if any listeners are like Nick and they don't want to hear about those kind of things, go listen to a different podcast.
Plus, obviously, you listened to part 1 first, so you already know this, but we do tend to joke around about this subject matter, and we do tend to curse. But if you just hate those things, turn us off, man. Go do something different. We respect it,
All right, Nikki. Are you ready to hear this story?
No.
Okay. Let's get started. Oh, man, there's no break. Is there a break?
Nope. You just got to keep going, baby.
My God, I will learn quickly.
All right. Story begins.
On May 21st, 1924, Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb sat chain smoking in the front of their rental car near a park in Kenwood, waiting impatiently for the Harvard School for Boys to end their classes for the day. They had installed privacy curtains in the back seat to hide their murdering and had all their tools laid out in the back: the chisel, the acid, the blanket, the rags. Nathan had spent the morning in class at the University of Chicago, like one does the day of a murder. Afterwards, he drove up to the rent-a-car in his red Willis Knight, took his law student cap off, and became Morton D. Ballard, traveling salesman from Peoria, Illinois, ready to pick up his rental car. So after picking up the rental, the boys drove both cars back to the Leopold mansion to drop off Nathan's car at the family garage. The family chauffeur, Sven Englund, was there as usual. Now, while preparing the rental car for the murder, in broad daylight in the garage, Nathan complained to Sven that the brakes on his red Willis Knight were squeaking. So Sven offered to oil the brakes, but warned Nathan he'd have to wait a bit before using it again, and he'd need to use his emergency brake to stop for a while or he might crash into someone. And Nathan said he didn't care about crashing into someone as long as he didn't have squeaky brakes.
Also, just if I'm not mistaken, they're in college, but they're still young teenagers at this point.
They're 19 at this point.
19.
18 and 19, I think.
Okay, which in 25 years is like 11 years old, right?
Kind of. So
Yeah.
they weren't considered minors. I mean,
Right.
they were considered adults
Yeah.
technically until the age of 21 back then in Chicago.
Okay.
Or nationally. I don't know. Sometimes I
Okay.
Google stuff and they're like, AI is really messing up Google, guys.
I know.
They will tell you
insane.
the wrong thing.
And then you rephrase it in a different way, and then you get a completely different answer.
Yeah.
It's really weird.
Yeah, it's super weird. The robots, not as smart as I thought they were going to be. But soon,
Hopefully. Or not.
they'll be our overlords. So
Okay.
come on, man. All right. So after leaving the Leopold garage around 2 p.m., the boys drove the rental car a few blocks from the Leopold mansion to a park across the street from the Harvard School for Boys. And just to reiterate, Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb lived about 3 blocks away from each other, and also like a couple blocks from the Harvard School for Boys. So we're talking about them doing this entire thing within like a 3-block radius of where they grew up and also went to school.
Yeah, where people see them all the time, like going into the hardware store to buy the tools.
Everyone knows what they look like. They're also pretty famous because their dads are super, super rich.
Yeah.
You know, so it's like one of them has been walking around shooting birds with a gun since he was 5 years old.
Yeah.
They know these guys.
They're like,
right?
yeah, I guess he's pretending to be a salesman right now. That's weird.
The perfect crime. All right, around 2:30, playing out his childhood stalking game, Richard Loeb set up on foot to look for a victim, whistling and signaling with Nathan, waving his hands around, who Nathan remained behind the wheel of the rental car. Now, at first...
What, they're trying to do like hand signals or something?
Yeah. They're trying to be like, hey, man.
Yeah,
they are. They're whistling.
That guy.
Yeah.
Let's get him.
They're whistling to each other. They're trying to like...
Making like strangling motions.
I mean, it's really dark, but it's like pretty much true.
Yeah, okay.
So at first, Richard set his sights on 4th grader Johnny Levinson, a friend of Richard's younger brother. So they all know each other. They sit around, they talk for a little bit, he chats him up. Now, Richard tried to stalk Johnny after that, but immediately lost him. So he and Nathan searched around the neighborhood for a while and then saw Johnny Levinson again, this time playing baseball with a group of boys in a vacant lot by their house. So they pulled the... Does people hear the dog?
The
Maybe.
dog's going off.
This neighborhood is amazing.
Okay.
All right. So he and Nathan were searching around for these boys, and they found this pickup baseball game. They pulled the rental car up across the street from the baseball game, but they were too far away to see which kid was which. And they thought it would be too suspicious. Like, they got out of the car at one point, and like Richard yelled, you know, hit it up there, and tried to act like he was cheering for the game. But they're just like, you know, 19-year-old guys like looking at 12-year-olds playing baseball. They're like, what are you doing?
Is hit it up there a direct quote, or is that what you would say if you were all of a sudden forced to pretend to know what was happening in baseball?
You know, for me, it's all the same. I don't really have any idea. I think he said, I didn't write it down. But
You
that's
think
what
he said hit it up there?
I think he said, hit it up there.
I don't. I think you think that's something someone would say around a baseball game.
If I don't write it down, I'm usually down to clowns.
Okay.
That's why I have this script.
Hit it up there. Swing
All right,
a big
so
circle and hit it up there.
they're sitting in this rental car across the street from the baseball lot, but they were too far away to see which kid was which. It was oh man, who are these kids? So they bailed on that. They went back to Nathan's house to go get his long distance bird hunting glasses because, Whatever.
Okay.
And then they got back to the vacant lot with the bird hunting glasses, staring through those glasses just in time to see Johnny Levinson disappear down an alley with a group of other kids. For the next 2 hours, they drifted around their neighborhood, stalking boys from the rental car, hoping to catch Johnny outside again and considering different kids from the neighborhood. But they never found Johnny. They assumed he got home, and that was that.
Okay. And the idea is they're going after boys because girls are either chauffeured or playing inside.
They're just like more, I think back then, traditionally, the girls in that neighborhood were more closely chaperoned. So they weren't like the boys could go out and play, even if they were from really wealthy families.
Yeah.
But the girls kind of had more of the, my governess is attached to my hip for my purity. That's what I'm guessing. Something like that.
Yeah.
So then, after kind of aimlessly stalking boys around the neighborhood, around 5 p.m. that day, they spotted Bobby Franks walking home alone. Now, Bobby was Richard's second cousin and Richard's next door neighbor. Their mothers were first cousins. Bobby was 14, but small for his age, only about 100 pounds. And his dad was the president of the Rockford Watch Company and a multimillionaire, very wealthy man. So he fit all the criteria, right? The boys wanted someone to snatch who was small and wealthy and another boy, right? Bobby actually he was a really great academic, he's a great student, and he had recently made a speech at a debate club criticizing capital punishment. Bobby wanted to be a lawyer when he grew up, and he thought since criminals had diseased minds, it should be a crime to punish them with death, and that all punishments should be reformative and never vindictive.
Okay.
Which is just ironic.
Right, because something horrible is going to happen to him.
Well, also, we'll find out in part 3 that this case was an unprecedented defense. So it was the first time a particular defense was used in court, and a lot of it hinged on whether or not the boys were going to get the death penalty. So it's a huge part of this story. Gotta find my place. So
I already hate what's gonna happen. So thanks for that. You're like, this is gonna be a fun as hell episode.
Oh, sorry. I
It's
know
okay.
You don't like murders. So Richard and Bobby pulled up alongside. Sorry,
what?
I messed up. Richard and Nathan. Pulled up alongside Bobby and offered him a ride, but Bobby said no, he's only a block and a half from his house. He was fine with walking. It was a nice day. So Richard changed tactics. He had played tennis with his second cousin on his estate a few times, and he ended up getting Bobby Franks into the car by asking Bobby questions about his new tennis racket. According to Nathan, he was driving the car at that point. And Richard was sitting in the front seat and then moved to the back seat to let Bobby sit up front. According to Richard, he was driving at that point, and it was actually Nathan who slid in the back seat to let Bobby up front. So regardless, there in broad daylight, in the quiet, elegant handful of blocks between their family mansions, whoever was in the back seat began bludgeoning Bobby Franks in the back of the head with a chisel.
Great.
And the boys expected the attack to totally incapacitate Bobby, but while Bobby was bleeding everywhere, all over the car, he was still conscious and making noises. So they just began to speed down the street, one of them still behind the wheel and the other one stuffing a rag down Bobby's throat until he suffocated.
Killing him right there. They
Yes.
just killed him in the car like that.
Immediately. Nathan and Richard drove around town with Bobby's body in the backseat until it got dark. They stopped for hot dogs and root beers at the dingy Dewdrop Inn on the south side of Chicago. And at some point, they stripped Bobby's body and poured acid on his face and genitals in an attempt to keep him from being identified.
The genitals?
So I've read a lot about this
Yeah.
in the
Of course you
two
have.
books that I've read.
Yeah.
I didn't see this. Somehow
What?
somebody sent me, I think, a happy birthday message, and I don't know if this got recorded, but balloons just came up across the screen.
Happy birthday, Muriel.
That's so weird. I don't know if this is going to be on the YouTube recording, but
No, I don't think it is.
so basically,
I mean, you talking to the camera about it will be, but whatever happened on the phone won't be.
okay, great.
Yeah.
Well, congratulations. I
Yeah.
don't know for sure, but I have read one thing that was like basically there weren't very many people outside the Jewish community at the time that were circumcised. And so that the acid was an attempt to disguise Bobby Frank's circumcision.
Yeah.
I don't know. There's also there's a lot of stuff we can't cover, but there was also kind of the question of whether or not Bobby Franks had been molested or if they were hiding something that they had done to him. Like,
right.
They don't. I think that has always been a question mark.
R.I.P. Bobby.
Yeah,
It's just absolute dumb ass monsters.
I know, and it just keeps getting stupider. To be
Yeah.
honest. So around 9 p.m., they drove to the nature preserve at Wolf Lake, Nathan Leopold's favorite birding spot.
With the culvert.
And they carried Bobby's body wrapped in a blanket, waded into the marshy water, and shoved his body into a drainage pipe. They posted the ransom note to the Franks' house for an early morning delivery, and then the boys scattered and burned Bobby's clothes and drove to Richard's house, where they parked on a dark street near his family's greenhouse and tried to wash out the worst of the bloodstains in the car. At 10:25 p.m., they called Bobby Frank's house and told his parents Bobby had been kidnapped, but he was safe and alive, and the family would receive further instructions in the morning to get Bobby back.
What, they just called them with their regular voice?
They said they had a fake name.
Okay.
But I think Nathan did the calling, so maybe they couldn't recognize him. But they definitely called using a fake name and probably described, tried to
Doing a voice.
Yeah.
We have your son.
Yeah, something like that. And then the boys went back to Nathan's house to drink and play cards with his family. And then late that night, Nathan drove Richard home. On the way, they threw the bloody chisel out the car window somewhere between their houses. Like I said, the perfect crime.
In this tiny little square block radius.
Yeah.
Cute.
Early the next morning, Tony Minky had just finished his night shift at the American Maize Product Company and was headed out to run an errand on foot. To save time, he cut through the forest preserve on Wolf Lake. And as he walked through the cold, wet grass near a culvert, he saw something white stuck inside the pipe. It looked very strange, whatever it was. So Tony went down to the embankment to have a closer look and saw two little bare feet sticking out of the water. Tony ran up the embankment. He called some nearby railroad workers for help. And the group splashed down to the culvert, thinking they'd found the body of a person who'd accidentally drowned. Instead, they pulled out a naked boy with gashes across his head and burn marks on his genitals and face. It was a terrible, terrible thing.
Yeah, it's just horrible. Can you imagine actually seeing that?
They searched the bushes hoping to find his clothes. Like maybe they could at least dress him and bring back some dignity to his body. But they couldn't find anything. Just a single pair of reading glasses. So they put the glasses on the boy and they brought him to authorities. Now, that same morning, the Franks got the ransom note, a demand for $10,000 and unmarked bills in a cigar box wrapped in white paper. The letter was strange to Bobby's father, Jacob Franks. It didn't seem to be the work of some low-life criminal. The letter was typed on very expensive paper and clearly written by an educated person with an almost legal style to their writing. The note claimed Bobby was safe and would be returned to the family in 6 hours if they followed instructions. Now, if the Franks made any misstep, if they violated any terms of the letter, like contacting the police, Bobby would be killed. And the Franks were instructed to wait for a phone call with further instructions and then meanwhile gather together the cash. Now, by this point, a reporter from the Chicago Daily News had somehow gotten the scoop that Bobby Franks had been kidnapped. So they knew, but they had agreed with the family not to publish the story until they had a chance to get Bobby back. So
wait, did the reporter ever disclose how they found out about it?
No, they didn't. Nobody, as far as I know, I don't think they knew who leaked it. But
I'm gonna guess those reporters had a sick underground network of like butlers and maids and housekeepers.
Easy.
And you know what I mean?
We'll talk about this a
Yeah.
little bit later, but like
Yeah.
back then,
Yeah.
the tactics that reporters were using, specifically in Chicago, where
Yeah.
like newspapers were like the biggest industry and that people were publishing multiple issues
Yeah,
a
right.
day, they were doing crazy stuff to get
Yeah.
attention. But and also, like, I didn't get really far into this, but they were also like used by the prosecution and defense often to like characterize certain people, and like they were granted interviews. Like they had this kind
Right.
of more
Yeah,
integral part in the legal system. I mean, it's like it was very Wild West,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So anyway,
It's horrible, but also kind of cool.
it's interesting. So he
Yeah.
got the scoop, and
Yeah.
he said, I'm not gonna break it until we figure out what's going on with Bobby. At least I'm gonna let you have your 6 hours to get your son back, right?
Yeah. It's like pat him on the back for being a good person, I guess. I don't know.
I mean, in
It's
a lot
so
of cases,
obviously the
that's not
ethical-
true.
Right,
People will
yeah.
break it, and it does
Yeah.
jeopardize.
No, you're
I mean,
right.
Back then, it did jeopardize.
You're right. Okay, so he
kidnapping.
gets a little medium pat on the back.
It
for
is a
being-
little bit, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
So when the newspaper got word the body of a young boy had been found that morning near Wolf Lake, they did send a message to the Franks family just in case. No one really thought it was Bobby Franks at first. They figured the kidnappers wanted to ransom him, not kill him. What incentive would they have just to immediately kill him?
Right.
So they described the boy to the Franks family over the phone, 10 to 12 years old, about 100 pounds, burn marks on his face and genitals, and that the boy wore glasses. And this flooded the Franks family with relief. Bobby didn't wear glasses, so it had to be some other boy. But just to make sure, Jacob Frank sent his brother-in-law down to the funeral home to look at the body and double check.
And probably the acid, they probably didn't even do a good job of like actually ruining his face, right?
Not at all.
Right.
What basically they didn't even know what had happened because all it did was give it a copper, like a copper colored stain, but it didn't do anything else. That same morning, Sven England sat in the Leopold family garage, totally confused, watching as Nathan Leopold did the most out of character thing he'd ever seen him do. Cleaning.
Yeah.
He had never seen him do anything ever like this. Baffled, right? The
He's like, hold on,
chauffeur's
let me call my.
He's like nervous.
He's like calling his reporter friend at the
Yeah,
Chicago
right.
Tribune. It's like, I don't know what's going on, but this kid is cleaning. There's definitely something is going down.
Nathan and his friend Richard were in the Leopold garage with a bucket and scrub brushes, scrubbing out what Sven assumed to be Richard's car. This, like, you know, the rental car, this tan sedan. Sven offered to help. He was like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. This is awkward, right?
Yeah.
But the boys were really quick to block him, saying in hushed voices that they'd done a little bootlegging last night and they'd spilled some red wine. And so they were like, hey, don't tell our parents, please, right? It's just a little bootlegging. We won't do it again, you know, that kind of thing.
Okay.
So afterwards, Nathan and Richard were off to complete the final, and for them, kind of the most thrilling phase of their perfect crime. They were going to lead the Franks family through a series of elaborate clues, resulting in a perfect ransom drop. But soon, the boys found themselves on a public street in Chicago in the afternoon sun, sweating, trying to tape a note to a garbage can. The stupid tape wouldn't stick. So like the plan's already getting very wonky, right? So they realized this note's going to blow away. We can't do this much of a complicated series of clues. So they simplified their plan and ditched the note. And then the next step in the plan was to call the Franks house, like they had said, and give Jacob Franks the address to a local drugstore. And then the boys would then send a yellow cab to the Franks house to pick him up, right? Take him to the drugstore. The cabbie who drove the yellow cab would have no instructions to the drop-off point, only Jacob Franks. After that, the boys had this whole thing, like I told you, I'm not going to explain the whole thing, but basically they're going to have the Jacob Franks like throw the ransom money off a moving train in this one particular spot. It's like very complicated. Right. So after they called the Franks, the plan was to put on disguises and then go board the specific train to tape up the final ransom instructions directing Jacob Franks to throw the money off a moving train.
But somehow a pharmacy, a drugstore is involved?
Because they're using public phones. So back then, if he goes to the drugstore and he stands in the back near the public phone, then they can call him from a different public phone and communicate. So there's a lot of that kind of stuff.
The perfect crime.
Exactly. So lots of moving parts with this one, but the boys are supremely confident. Meanwhile, Jacob Frank's brother-in-law stood over a boy's body on an examination table on the south side of Chicago. The face was discolored from acid, but when he removed the glasses and examined the boy's teeth, he knew it was Bobby. Bobby had a childhood disease called rickets that had left little pearled marks across his teeth.
Oh, that's so sad. R.I.P. Bobby. This is horrific, man.
That afternoon, Jacob Franks sat tensely waiting for the kidnapper's phone call, the $10,000 in cash, neatly wrapped up and waiting.
But instead he gets this other phone call.
And the Franks hadn't involved police at this point in good faith that the ransom exchange would happen.
Yeah.
The phone rang, but it wasn't the kidnapper. It was the call no one was expecting, the call informing the Franks that Bobby's body had been identified. Jacob Franks was totally blindsided. And then a few minutes later, the phone rang again. They snatched up the receiver, hoping it was someone with word that there had been a mix-up, that it wasn't Bobby's body. Instead, it was the kidnapper with the ransom instructions. So reeling, Jacob Franks listened to this kidnapper talk as if Bobby were still alive.
Yeah.
Telling Franks, oh, this yellow cab is going to be at your house soon to pick you up. And then telling Franks to go to a certain drugstore for the next set of instructions. And when the kidnapper hung up, Jacob Franks realized he couldn't remember the drugstore address. He'd been too shocked to retain it and he hadn't written anything down.
Yeah. Poor father.
And then...
And how could you? What would you even do?
Right, what would you even do?
Yeah.
Suddenly
you have to like snap into spy mode and decide like, is it better for me to go along with it to track him down that way, or should we just get the police involved immediately?
But he has no address also. Like that,
right? Because he's not
to it. Right. I mean, right. Is he
that's my point. It's just
it?
like, what are you supposed to do? Suddenly, you're just like Michael Fassbender and Kate Blanchett in Black Bag, just like playing all the angles.
Yeah,
it's like
right.
impossible. It's so sad.
And then the doorbell rang. Right, the yellow cab was there immediately to pick up Jacob Franks.
Yeah,
and the house just erupted into chaos. Flora Franks didn't know what was going on at first, so she told the cabbie no one had called for a cab and tried to send him away. And then flustered, Jacob Franks comes running out, demanding to know who'd sent the cab and the address of the destination. Franks is yelling at the cabbie, saying, who sent you and where is the drop-off point? And the cabbie had no idea what they were talking about and yelled back, mad that no one knew the address and was wasting his time. The cabbie had been sent by dispatch. He had no idea who sent him.
Yeah.
And then eventually it sunk in that none of that mattered. The drugstore address didn't matter, really. They weren't going to get Bobby back. So meanwhile, while all this stuff is going down, Nathan and Richard are all amped up, walking to the next public phone to call Jacob Franks at this drugstore when they noticed the headline splashed all across the daily papers.
Oh, this is his Michael Corleone coming out of the thing with K moment.
A headline about the body of a boy found in a culvert near Wolf Lake. Their plan had fallen apart in less than a day. And they argued right there on the street how it was a stupid place to hide the body. Now the whole thing was ruined about whether to try and call Jacob Franks at the drugstore anyway to try to get the ransom money. And eventually they decided to try and salvage the plan. Maybe Jacob Franks hadn't identified the body yet.
Mm-hmm.
But when they tried calling the drugstore, Jacob Franks was nowhere to be found, and they knew that the jig was up. Over the next couple of days, the boys laid low, destroyed more evidence, but even in the aftermath of their failure, they were 100% confident that they'd never be caught.
Did they start to feel any remorse or anything, like, besides, like, because at one point in part one you said I think Richard was like a liar who just like never felt bad about lying ever.
So this is what's really interesting about how this story unfolds and like why we believe certain things. So according to most sources, I don't think either boy showed very much remorse at all, but actually it was Richard later who admitted starting to feel bad, like feel a little bad about his mom's cousin, about Bobby's mother, like pieces of it, not the whole thing, but just elements of it.
Well, you know, I guess we'll figure out and never know at the same time what their ultimate like repercussions for this. But in the moment, I'm at least feeling some schadenfreude for them realizing that they did a dumb plan.
Well,
like they're feeling
no,
stupid, but
they don't feel they had this meltdown. Like it didn't work the way they wanted. They were 100% confident they would never be caught because they felt, okay, well, we might not have pulled off the perfect kidnapping, but they definitely had pulled off the perfect murder. Well, the first thing investigators had was a ton of circumstantial evidence pointing to the killer being a Kenwood local, right? Bobby was kidnapped near his Kenwood home, for starters. And you know, Bobby didn't have a life outside of Kenwood. He was a young boy.
Yeah.
He went to school a few blocks from his house. So, like, it's not like somebody could have figured out who he was or that he was a millionaire's son unless they were in Kenwood watching him, right? Bobby was... also a boy from the neighborhood had actually seen Bobby walking home the day he was murdered. He was walking behind Bobby down the block. And for a moment, he looked away briefly. He was looking at some flowers or some plant life and like thinking about something. So he says, I was looking at something else.
Let's be a little kid for a second.
Yeah, right. And he said he looked back and weirdly, Bobby was gone. He wasn't on the sidewalk anymore. And a car was speeding away. But in that moment, he didn't hear anything. He didn't hear any shouts or screaming or car doors slamming, anything that indicated that, you know, this had been an abduction. So it was assumed that Bobby may have gotten into the car voluntarily, so he might have known the killer.
Sure.
And because the body was found 20 miles away from Kenwood, the killer had to have a car. But here's the thing. The day after the killing, a Kenwood local had turned over a bloody chisel to police, the suspected murder weapon. He had seen a car drive by and toss the chisel out the window. So this indicated the killer may have abducted Bobby from Kenwood, killed Bobby, drove 20 miles away to dump the body, and then came back to Kenwood. So again, pointing to a local. But the police investigation was, at least in the beginning, admittedly a little clunky. So police didn't really consider or focus on the circumstantial evidence at first. They went into the hard evidence, like analyzing the ransom note. And of course, tracking down these glasses found near Bobby's body that didn't belong to him. All right, so 1924, we're in the era of newspaper insanity. So many newspapers, especially in the Chicago market, there were so many of them, right? And people read them voraciously. The competition between papers to get the biggest scoop was monstrous. Reporters would do anything for a story. They would make fake badges in order to impersonate utility workers, firemen, undertakers, anything that would help them get that exclusive interview. They would go through garbage, they would tap into phone lines, and they would listen through walls with stethoscopes. Even if they couldn't get into a trial, they would hang through air ducts on ropes in the courtrooms. So...
Yeah, it's either totally like an admirable, cool thing or just like the weirdest, sleaziest
most
thing.
Predatory. Yeah.
I don't know.
Like
it's hard.
Spiders crawling through the walls.
It seems like kind of fun and cool and also totally predatory and, wrong.
Yeah. So the kidnapping and murder of Bobby Franks, the millionaire's son, was the city's biggest story, and it was front page news on day one. And Richard Loeb ate everything up, read every news story. He was basically living his lifelong fantasy.
Yeah.
He was the master criminal behind the crime of the century, and no one knew about it. Richard couldn't help but tease the edges of the investigation. He had a few friends who were reporters, like for a newspaper and then for like the University of Chicago campus paper. And he managed to talk them into going on an adventure to find this drugstore where Jacob Franks was supposed to make contact with the kidnappers. He's like, oh, no one else has scooped that. Maybe we should do it, guys. And then they found the drugstore with Richard's help. And he's like with them doing this. And when one of the reporters asked Richard about his second cousin, to add a personal flair to his article, instead of saying something sweet or sentimental, Richard straight up said, quote, if I were going to murder anyone, I would murder just such a cocky little son of a bitch as Bobby Franks. And they didn't include it in the article. He says, don't use my name. I don't want to be in that. But that's what he said to all his friends in this car.
Jesus Christ.
Richard tagged along with his reporter friends to the inquest on Bobby Franks' death, too. He heard about Bobby and how he had suffocated to death from a rag in his throat. And, he heard about the confusion around Bobby's being naked. Authorities said they didn't think he'd been sexually assaulted, but it was hard to tell for certain. And at this inquest, no one talked about why potentially Bobby's genitals had been splashed with acid, too. For his part, Nathan Leopold didn't pay attention to the papers at all. He had lost a lot of study time during the murder, and he was just focused on catching up on his coursework. Remember, he's going to Yale Law School in the fall.
Yeah.
And, he was just like, I'm just behind.
And he's an all-star
really
student.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Nothing in the news caught his attention until Friday on the 23rd, 2 days after the murder, when he opened a paper and saw a picture of his reading glasses on the first page.
Of course.
His stupid goddamn reading glasses, the glasses he barely used, had fallen out of his pocket and onto the grass while they were stuffing Bobby Franks' body in the culvert. Nathan thought it wasn't a big deal, though. They were mild prescription reading glasses, very common. And Nathan could prove he went birding in the area all the time. Even if the glasses were traced to him, he had the perfect explanation. He had been birding there 3 days before the murder. So perfectly calm, happy, content. That night, Richard and Nathan took a couple girls to the swanky Edgewater Beach Hotel on Chicago's North Side for dinner and dancing. 2 days later, on Sunday the 25th, the investigation was dragging a little. So hoping to find some new leads, investigators went to Wolf Lake to see if they could find any witnesses. And some park workers mentioned a kid who came to the forest preserve really often to look for birds. And, maybe he knows something, right?
Yeah.
He noticed something.
Yeah.
So at that morning at 11 a.m., police pulled up to the Leopold mansion to speak with Nathan, not as a suspect, just hoping he could provide some information.
Yeah.
And Nathan came off as an awkward, quiet child prodigy with no need for money. He didn't seem suspicious in the least. And yes, he'd been to Wolf Lake before for birding, but he said, I didn't see anything, and I don't own any glasses. I never wore glasses.
Oh, he should have just said, "Those are my glasses." No, he shouldn't have. I don't know what he should have done.
I think he should have said, I did drop some glasses, maybe. I don't know, actually.
I wouldn't even have brought that up.
I don't know, maybe not.
Don't bring it up, but just don't say you never wore glasses.
He said, I never wore glasses. They asked him, do you wear glasses? And he said, no, I never wore them. And at the time, it all seemed on the up and up, fully believable. 4 days later, though, the glasses came back to bite Nathan in the ass in a very big way. On Thursday, May 29th, investigators discovered the glasses had this super unique hinge only manufactured in a company in Brooklyn, New York.
I was going to say, I bet you this rich kid has some fancy specific glasses. He's like, they're very common. Everyone gets their glasses from this, whatever, fancy Brooklyn person.
Right.
You get it.
Only one shop sold them in Chicago. And they had only sold 3 pairs. One to a guy who had been out of the country at the time of the murder. One to a lady who still had her glasses and easily produced them. And one to 19-year-old Nathan Leopold.
The boy who never had glasses.
So now, of course, they wanted to talk to Nathan again. Thursday, May 29th, they went back to the Leopold mansion and talked to him. And Nathan admitted, oh, yeah, I do wear glasses, but he said, I rarely wore them at all. I haven't seen them in forever, dudes. And, he was sure they're just in his house somewhere in this giant mansion.
Yeah.
But this was enough to bring Nathan in for questioning. So now back in 1924, questioning the son of one of the most influential men in Chicago was a delicate thing. Instead of taking him into the station, police took Nathan to a suite at a nice hotel that they had rented for the purposes of questioning him away from the prying eyes of reporters. And there at the hotel, they showed Nathan the glasses found near the body of Bobby Franks, along with the typed ransom note. Now, Nathan was cool as a cucumber. Yes, he did have a pair of glasses like that, but his glasses, he was sure, were somewhere in his room amongst his thousands of dead birds, right? Yes, he agreed. Okay, yeah, the note seemed to be written by an educated person, maybe with a legal background, but that had nothing to do with him. And yes, it would make sense the killer was familiar with the area around Wolf Lake like Nathan was. But again, that had nothing to do with him. Police at this point decided it was time to ask where Nathan was the night of the murder. And at first Nathan said, I have no idea. I just can't remember. But that seemed pretty dumb, right?
Okay.
Nathan was a child prodigy who had a clear memory about other things. Like, how could he not know where he was and what he did just 8 days ago? So they pushed him harder. And Nathan had a sudden burst of memory, a crystal clear alibi. And here's where it really came off the wheels for the boys. See, they had concocted an alibi for the night of the murder, right? Okay, they drove Nathan's Willis night all day. They had lunch at Marshall Fields and then went drinking and bird watching in Lincoln Park. They had dinner out at a restaurant. And then afterwards, they didn't want to go home. So they picked up a couple girls and tried to pay them for sex. These 2 girls, Edna and May, they didn't get their last names. And then the girls refused to go all the way. So Nathan kicked them out of the car in the middle of the night near some golf course.
Great. Classic. Just being a gentleman.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Boys will be boys.
And the alibi was just another meticulously crafted element of their perfect plan. But here's the thing. The boys had agreed that they'd only use the alibi if they were questioned directly after the murder. Now, after a week passed, they decided to ditch the alibi altogether and say they didn't remember what they were doing that night. It seemed more smooth and realistic that way. So the alibi would only last 7 days, but this was the 8th day. Now,
this is when people think they're smart. They're just like, you just get too smart. And then you're just like, it's like, you think you're in first place, but really you're just getting lapped by everyone else.
Yeah. So because Nathan implicated Richard in his alibi, police went to bring Richard in for questioning. And Nathan had absolutely no idea what Richard was going to say. And that's what we'll pick up next week.
Good job for this juicy trilogy. Available right now on patreon.com/Muriel's Murders or through the Spotify Muriel's Murders thing.
It's so juicy. It gets way juicier too.
Yes.
Like pretty juicy.
Okay, great.
Like
Okay.
yum yum.
Okay, all right, stop. R.I.P. Bobby.
Sorry.
Damn, Muriel. Psycho. Thank you so much for listening to Muriel's Murders. Muriel did all the research. She did the writing. She did the hosting. I did the producing. You did the listening, and we love you for that. And that's it. Mario Castellini does our theme music. And find us on social media. Go to murielsmurders.com for information. I don't
Love
know.
yourself.
What else?
Have a good weekend.
Yes.
Or wherever when you're listening to this. It's our weekend right now.
Yeah. All right. Great. We love you guys. Bye.